Hi, my name's Lindsay Hutari, and I'm working towards completing my Human Resources diploma. My overall goal is to help people in the workplace, but for now what I want to do is I want to teach you a little bit about discrimination, accommodation, and undue hardship in the workplace. What we're going to do is we are going to start by giving you some basic terms that will give you some base knowledge about the information that's going to be found within the case. Then we're going to go in the case itself and review and point out some of the highlights and instances of discrimination in the workplace because of a failure to accommodate.
The dictionary defines accommodation as, in relation to human resources, an arrangement, settlement, or compromise. When a person's unable to do their job as it was originally designed, an accommodation needs to take place. This can be done in many forms, but should always be done on a case-to-case basis to suit the employee's needs. Understanding the definition of disability per the Ontario Human Rights Commission is the next important part of the accommodation process. Defining disability is both a complex and evolving matter. The term disability is pretty broad and covers a range of different conditions. This could be something that is present at birth, caused by an incident, or it's developed over time. Disability should be interpreted in broad terms. It includes both present and past conditions, as well as the possibility of a disability in the future. This would apply to a person that doesn't currently have a disability, but they're treated like they could. The focus should always be on the current abilities of a person and the situation's risks rather than the limitations or risks that may not arise in the future. Disability and accommodation are two very important aspects to the County of Brant case that we're about to look at. First, we will review the facts of the case, then look at applicable legislation, followed by an analysis and personal interpretation, including my human resources management recommendations. We'll then look at the decision and my opinion of that decision. So the facts of the case are pretty straightforward. In March of 2013, the County of Brant brought the original decision that was made by the labor arbitrator back to have it reassessed. They didn't agree with the decision that they were given. So the backstory of the case is in October of 2010, an advanced care paramedic was given sedentary supervisory duties because he had been injured on the job. What that included was basic housekeeping items such as sweeping, mopping, cleaning up, things like that. In December, he had gotten to a place in his recovery that he no longer needed the entire accommodation that he had originally been provided. He had his doctor drop a note that stated that he was in fact fit to go back to a certain point in his duties. He had no problems with his right foot and left hand, but his shoulder was still giving him some problems, so he couldn't lift anything over 40 pounds. Being able to ride third and return to a more active role as an advanced care paramedic was an important aspect to Mr. Canane. he wanted to be able to keep working on his designated skills that he required to be an advanced care paramedic. This would put him closely aligned with what he had previously been doing and not having him have to exacerbate the injury on his shoulder anymore. The union argued on Mr. Kinane's behalf that per Article 2.02 of their collective agreement, there should have been an accommodation made that would allow Mr. Kinane to ride third. The doctor's note that he provided should have been sufficient support for this. The County of Brant, who I will refer to as Brant from this point forward, they believed that riding third would be a fairly large safety concern, that they had already done their due diligence by their initial accommodation that they had provided Mr. Kinane, that sweeping, mopping, and cleaning vehicles was more than suitable, and that until he had been cleared 100% to be able to return to work in his regular capacity, that they didn't need to further any accommodations for him. The labor arbitrator ruled that due to the safety concerns that Brant had, they hadn't quite met that undue hardship that they would have had to meet in order to forego changing the accommodation. The Ontario Human Rights Commission labels undue hardship as part of the code that needs to have 3 conditions met in order to decide whether an accommodation can or cannot happen. The cost, outside sources of funding, and health and safety requirements. Cost and outside sources of funding were not an issue. They focused on the health and safety requirements. They did not meet that need. The Ontario Human Rights Commission and the Human Rights Code have a few pretty important sections. The collective agreement was also a pretty important player in the case. The County of Brant had felt that they already filled their obligation to accommodate Mr. Kinane, where they focused on the wordings and the use of the word may. The part that they had failed to focus on was the part that stated that an employee that had submitted appropriate medical documentation could be accommodated by riding third in the car, and that would allow them to maintain their skill level. It's also important to look at the Ontario Human Rights Commission's Section 9.1 that basically states that you can't negotiate in your collective agreements away the right to accommodation, or you can't negotiate to be discriminated against. After going over the case, my analysis is a few things. The doctor's note that was provided by Mr. Kinane should have been enough to warrant the change of his accommodation, and the County of Brant should have done that. They needed to individualize that accommodation and allow it to remain fluid so that changes, whether positive or negative, could be done in order to carry along with how his recovery was going. Individualization in a person's accommodation is very important. What applies to one person does not necessarily apply to another person. You can't say that employee A was able to go back to work within this amount of time, so employee B should be able to do the same. That's why individualization should be at the top of the importance list when you're making an accommodation plan. I agree with the arbitrator in his decision that Brandt was unable to show any sort of undue hardship. Not only did they not have any sort of financial loss, they didn't require any outside sources of funding in order to accommodate Mr. Kinane, and he didn't pose a risk to himself, other employees, or the public. What I would recommend as a human resource manager is that Mr. Kinane should have been included in what the accommodations were and the change to his accommodations. He needs to have that plan reviewed and revisited. Doctor's note needs to be taken into consideration, and if they'd like more clarification, have a consult with him. They also need to find an appropriate ambulance that will highlight his ACP designation and allow him to ride third. This could be a slower ambulance or in an area that doesn't get as many calls, but an appropriate ambulance does need to be found. In addition to revisiting the accommodation plan, the County of Brant needs to understand that it's something that they will have to frequently revisit until Mr. Kinane is 100% back to his working capacity. This information should also all be kept private. Supervisors and managers who are directly related with Mr. Kinane will have access to that plan, but for all other extensive purposes, nobody else should be able to have access, and that information should not be kept in his personnel file.
I chose this case because it highlights the importance of not only accommodating your employees, but also making sure to revisit and revise any accommodations as the need arises. The County of Brant could have saved themselves a lot of trouble had they just taken the wishes of Mr. Kinane into account and gone ahead and adhered to the collective agreement.